Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you to make your way here on this warm summer's day. I'm very pleased on behalf of the German Historical Institute to welcome Professor Dan Stone, our lecturer, but also, of course, the head of the Leo Baeck Institute London, Dr. Joe Cronin, who will chair tonight's evening. And the summer lecture of the Leo Baeck Institute London is a relatively new event format. It's a second summer lecture, and I'm very, very pleased that we could team up with the Leo Baeck Institute and that we are able to host this lecture. And with that, I will hand over to Joe Cronin, who will, I am sure, be a wonderful host.
Thank you very much, Christina. Great to see so many people here. So good evening. My name is Joe Cronin. I'm the director of the Leo Baeck Institute London, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our annual summer lecture. It is only the second, but we're hoping to make it a tradition, which, as you can see, we co-host in collaboration with the German Historical Institute London, and it's wonderful to be in this stunning venue again. Tonight's lecture will be delivered by Professor Dan Stone of Royal Holloway, University of London. Professor Stone, I'm sure, is familiar to many of you, a distinguished historian of modern Europe with particular expertise in the history and historiography of the Holocaust. Professor Stone is an extremely prolific researcher and writer. He has written over 90 scholarly articles, and I've written here 17 books, but I think it's now 20 works. This spans the history of fascism, genocide, theories of race, and of course, the Holocaust. His two most recent books, I think, are The Holocaust: An Unfinished History, which was published by Pelican Books in 2022, and Fate Unknown, Tracing the Missing After World War II and the Holocaust, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2023. And I think he has got another book forthcoming on this very topic that he's going to speak about tonight. In addition to his scholarly work, Professor Stone engages extensively with the public through blogs, book reviews, podcasts, documentaries, and exhibitions. He has curated a number of important exhibitions at the Wiener Holocaust Library. Just to take one example, the exhibition Death Marches, Evidence and Memory, which was held in 2021. Professor Stone is also the director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, where he supervises PhD students, organizes talks and workshops, and collaborates with various institutions to promote Holocaust education and research worldwide. I could say much more, but I think you'd probably rather hear from Dan Stone this evening. So it's a real privilege to have Professor Stone with us this evening to explore the fascinating topic of psychologists in Auschwitz and their strategies for survival. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dan Stone.
I've been based at Royal Holloway for 25 years now, and the first time I spoke in this room was not long after arriving at Royal Holloway at an event connected to one of Ulrich Herbert's edited books. So it's very nice to be here again doing this particular lecture. The starting point for what I want to say tonight is this book, Last Stop Auschwitz, by the Dutch psychoanalyst Eddy de Wind, the contents of which are rather more interesting than it looks. This is a book which, if any of you are familiar with the popular Holocaust books that you find on the shelves in Waterstones, rows and rows of blue stripy books, this falls into that category. And for that reason, when it first appeared, I kind of ignored it and thought, no, I'm not reading that. And then I read something about it and thought, that's actually quite interesting. So what I'm going to say tonight is based on de Wind's book and his later work, which led me then to the work of two other Dutch survivor psychoanalysts, Louis Micheels and Elie Cohen, and those are the writers about whom I'm going to speak. So, according to the German psychotherapist living in exile in New York after the war, writing in 1948, death in a Nazi concentration camp requires no explanation. Survival does. In the years after the war, many psychologists and psychoanalysts turned their attention to the Nazi camps, taking up Bloom's claim, but there was nothing like consensus amongst them. So beginning with the well-known and still extraordinarily popular work of Viktor Frankl and Bruno Bettelheim, what I'm going to do in this lecture is show how psychoanalytic theories that provided a more sober version of survival were submerged under the weight of the positive thinking that proved so compatible with the zeitgeist of the 1950s and 1960s. Today, the theories of survival put forward by neglected analysts, such as Eddy de Wind and his colleagues Louis Micheels and Elie Cohen, appear to be much more in keeping with the ways in which our understanding of the Holocaust has changed in light of several decades worth of intensive, detailed, and methodologically innovative and varied historiography. Then, what follows, I'll summarize the arguments of these three Dutch inmate physicians who survived Auschwitz and went on to practice as psychoanalysts, drawing on their memoirs and from their analytical and clinical writings. I'll then argue that the incipient theory of trauma that they, among other analysts of the time, such as Hans Keilson, were developing had little purchase in the post-war period for reasons internal to psychoanalysis and because of wider cultural preoccupations. I'll conclude by showing why today, by contrast, their work makes sense, psychoanalytically and historiographically speaking, in ways that it couldn't in earlier decades. So, 2 years before Bloom's article appeared, Viktor Frankl claimed that the, quote, apparent paradox that some prisoners of a less hardy makeup seemed to survive camp life better than did those of a robust nature could be explained by virtue of the fact that such, quote, sensitive people were able to retreat from their terrible surroundings to a life of inner riches and spiritual freedom. Similarly, although from a different therapeutic perspective, Bruno Bettelheim argued that even if luck was the first prerequisite for survival, quote, most of all, autonomy, self-respect, inner integration, a rich inner life, and the ability to relate to others in meaningful ways were the psychological conditions which more than any others permitted one to survive the camps as much a whole human being as overall conditions and chance would permit. Okay, so Frankl's critics have pointed out that his claims not only serve to ingratiate himself with the Austrian authorities by deflecting attention from the perpetrators to the victims, but marginalized those victims who died by implying that they lacked the right will to live. Lawrence Langer, writing over 40 years ago, was one of the first to call into question the Frankl cult, arguing that intoxicated by his therapeutic view of human experience, including the Holocaust, Frankl makes physical survival a matter of mental health. There were no doubt some survivors who believed that their survival was due to those factors proposed by Frankl, that's to say, a conscious desire to want to live. But the critics are unpersuaded that this constitutes a convincing explanation for the problem posed by Hilda Bloom. Similar criticisms have been leveled against Bettelheim, from claims that he lied about his qualifications, to charges of plagiarism, to those who object to his claim that inmates identified with the guards, and, most relevant here, assertions that his theories of survival led ultimately to blaming the victims, most famously in his essay on Anne Frank and her family, where he argued that they failed to survive by not hiding well enough and not having a gun, which is, it's quite a thing to read, that essay. It's not really necessary to rehearse these well-known arguments here. This essay is not an exercise in bashing Bettelheim and Frankl. There's more to be said than that. It's nevertheless worth noting that Ernst Fehden, the son of the noted Freudian psychoanalyst Paul Fehden, who knew Bettelheim when both were inmates in Dachau and Buchenwald, noted that by the time Bettelheim was in the latter camp, September 1938 to April 1939, it had become, quote, a work camp where life was very bad indeed, but it was possible to survive, even for a person as unsuited to the practicalities of life as Bettelheim. Veden, who after 5 months in Dachau spent 7 years in Buchenwald, then noted of Bettelheim that he owed his survival to the chance of finding work in the stock mending shop, where he could live in relative safety, thus discreetly passing over Bettelheim's supposedly psychoanalytically informed theories without comment. Another psychologist who mistrusted Bettelheim's claims was the Dutch survivor Eddy de Wind, who noted calmly that he had quite a few objections to Bettelheim's work. Not least was the fact that Bettelheim had not been in an extermination camp and did not appreciate the conditions faced by the inmates in a place such as Auschwitz. And so it's to de Wind now that I'm going to turn first. Until 2020, this book, Last Stop Auschwitz, was known only to a small number of Dutch speakers. The book, written in a few weeks while de Wind was working as a survivor physician with Soviet medics in post-liberation Auschwitz, and reckoned, at least by the marketers of the book, to be the only book completed in Auschwitz while the camp was still in existence, was published in Dutch by a small communist publishing house in 1946. Reissued only once in Dutch in 1980, it has recently appeared in English as Last Stop Auschwitz and numerous other translations. The book, as well as de Wind's subsequent output in psychiatry journals, merit consideration not only because in his professional writing, he adumbrated what later became known as PTSD and much of the underpinnings of trauma theory. He also advocated a theory of survival that offers a compelling contrast to well-known self-help theories put forward by Bettelheim and especially Frankl. As we will see, like other Dutch survivor physicians, de Wind proposed a more sober analysis of survival, in his case, centered on the concept of stupor. In Last Stop Auschwitz, de Wind's protagonist is named Hans van Dam, although it's clear that in every detail the book is autobiographical. Although it omits the first stages of de Wind's actual camp journey, from volunteering to work as an inmate doctor at Westerbork in 1942 in order to help his mother, to meeting and marrying his wife Friedel in Westerbork, the story of Hans, most of which covers his time in Block 9 at Auschwitz I, is obviously about de Wind himself. Hans works first at Block 28 and is lucky to have several meetings with his wife, also in the book called Friedel, who is in Block 10. She also sends him food when she can. After 2 weeks, Hans is transferred to Block 9, where he works as assistant to the admissions doctor. After a few weeks, Hans understands, at least in retrospect, what Auschwitz means. And here you see, I think, why the book was published by a communist publishing house. Sounds a little bit like some of Primo Levi's early post-war Italian essays about the concentration camp system. Auschwitz was more than torment writ large. With its factories and mines, it was an important part of the Upper Silesian industrial area, and its workers were cheaper than anywhere else in the world. They didn't need pay, and they ate almost nothing. And then, when they were exhausted and fell victim to the gas chamber, there were still enough Jews and political opponents in Europe to make up the numbers yet again. Witnessing numerous deadly beatings, being transferred to the quarantine block and a stint in the Strafkommando, the punishment squad, and finding ways of remaining in touch with Friedel, Hans adapts to life in the camp, aware of the fortune his position brings him, as well as the risks. He survives several moves, ending up as a Pfleger or nurse in Block 19, where he is able to remain when the camp is evacuated in January 1945. Friedel, however, is evacuated on the death march, and Hans has no way of knowing whether or not she survived. The story itself is not really my focus here. Rather, I want to focus on how, but you need to know it in order to understand what comes next. I want to focus on how de Wind reflected on his experiences after the evacuation of the camp and later on when explaining his survival. At the end of the book, Hans ponders this question, asking himself, why was he alive? What gave him the right to live? In what way was he better than all those millions who had died? It fell to de Wind, rather than his alter ego Hans, to address those questions in the years after Auschwitz. This book contains an essay in it also as one of the afterwords, called Confrontation with Death, an essay first published in Dutch in 1949 and some years later published in English. And in that essay, he argues that in order to survive the concentration camp, the inmate had neither to surrender completely nor to resist with all his vitality. Both were sure paths to death. Rather, he proposes the paradox that reconciling oneself to death was a vital condition for the prisoner, and that what he calls the death principle, to distinguish it from Freud's death drive, which in ordinary life should be kept at bay, was, as he says, a necessity in the camp. The inmate, in other words, had to develop a camp psyche, a state of stupor that did not completely dominate, but was characterized by a form of inner acceptance of death, tempered by the preservation of just enough vitality to give the right answer at critical moments. He provides an example of a patient who, as de Wind said, found the right style and developed, although not consciously, a remarkable capacity to let insult and injury pass him by virtually unnoticed. This wasn't a man who devoted himself to religious or political ideas or who sought out the solace and support of comradeship, but a man who himself did not understand how he had survived. If readers didn't want to hear such analysis, it wasn't only because of the changed political circumstances of emerging Cold War Europe, but because, as de Wind pointed out, quote, even years after the war, he was writing in 1949, we regularly see how difficult it is to reverse the far-reaching alteration of personality that took place in the camps. After confrontation with death, de Wind furthered his argument with case studies that he examined in later articles based on his clinical work. And by the time these articles were published in the 1970s and 80s, de Wind's arguments were starting to make sense in the psychoanalytic community and beyond, thanks to his discovery of PTSD in the wake, not his, to the broader discovery of PTSD in the wake of the Vietnam War. Although the clinical understanding of trauma is often attributed to an attempt to make sense of the symptoms displayed by American veterans of Vietnam, with the exception of the scandal of My Lai, the focus was almost never on their victims. In fact, we can now see that psychoanalysts were groping towards an understanding of similar symptoms that had been exhibited by Holocaust survivors since the end of the war. The question here is not the novelty of the symptoms, but why the prevailing attitude towards them changed sufficiently for clinicians to be able to see them in a way that had previously not been possible. As de Wind noted in one piece from 1984, immediately after the war, general practitioners, as well as most psychiatrists, thought that only a few of the victims of the Nazis would suffer from their dreadful experiences for a long time, or perhaps for the rest of their lives. Psychoanalysts, he then went on, could have known better. Referring to the post-Great War focus on war neurosis, as well as the recognition after World War II of the possibility of lasting effects of concentration camp traumatization, de Wind implies that at that point, the idea put forward by his Dutch colleague Jacques Taz that, quote, the traumatization was so massive that an irreversible injury would occur was not yet one that psychoanalysis was ready to accept. Nevertheless, 13 years earlier, in an article of 1971, de Wind had himself been less decisive. On the one hand, groping towards the new understanding, he wrote that the problem of psychic trauma in adult life seems to be in contradiction to the psychoanalytic theories of the importance of the early life in determining the personality patterns as well as the nature of the emotional problems. Yet a few pages later, in the same piece, he drew back somewhat, restating the more orthodox position that, quote, traumatization by persecution or other traumatic events in adult life is probably always unconsciously linked with memories of infantile traumata. He acquired more confidence in his views over time. De Wind's use of the term traumatization in the 1970s and 80s followed Henry Crystal's groundbreaking study of 1968, massive psychic trauma, as well as works by Robert Lifton and, as de Wind put it, so many publications on Vietnam victims, etc., brackets, unfortunately. In massive psychic trauma, Crystal and William Nederland argued on the basis of 20 years clinical practice with camp survivors that, quote, we are dealing here with victims of a traumatization of such magnitude, severity, and duration as to produce a recognizable clinical syndrome. This isn't simply an aside. Christel and Nederland's identification and definition of the survivor syndrome was connected to theories of survival. De Wind not only foreshadowed the concept of PTSD, he also put forward a proposition about which psychological predispositions facilitated survival. Christel and Nederland took this idea further, arguing that the prevalence of psychosomatic illnesses among Holocaust survivors was revealing. Whereas, they write, people with schizophrenic or self-destructive tendencies were very quickly killed in the ghettos and concentration camps, the hyper-alert and exceedingly pliable and adjustable individuals apparently had a better chance of survival. This claim is, I think, compatible with De Wind's notion of survival through stupor, for despite the emphasis on stupor, this is a theory of adaptability. One had to adapt oneself and position oneself in this sense of stupor in the camp in order to survive, according to De Wind. The occurrence of psychosomatic illnesses among survivors then, especially in the group aged between 15 and 30 during the persecution, relates, according to Christel and Nederland, to the experience of overwhelming rage and despair under complete passivity. Whereas somatic symptoms occur less frequently in survivors who had been able to be active in their survival or who had fought the Nazis, for those who had to adapt and suppress their instincts in the way described by De Wind, the results are different. And I quote, apparently, passivity and especially arrest in motility, as in long periods of hiding in limited space, led to greater somatization of anxiety and tension. The significance of those quotations from these works, particularly in the post-war period, in the 1950s and 60s, is that in the restitution process in West Germany, the West German government liked to employ orthodox Freudian assessors who stuck to the notion that psychoanalytic disturbances related to early childhood traumata, as De Wind just put it, sexual abuse and so on in childhood, and that the orthodoxy at the time was that in adulthood, that if people suffered an abuse or violence or an accident, this would only result in long-term trauma if it already brought to the fore something that had occurred to them in early childhood. And so many concentration camp survivors had their claims for restitution rejected on the basis that their suffering couldn't solely have been caused by their experiences in the camps. And this caused people like Anna Freud and her colleagues to suddenly wake up and think, hang on, our theory is being used against us here. And to here you see the origins of the kind of post-Holocaust idea of trauma as it later then fed into the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the APA in 1980, which I'll come to in a moment. So this had very real world consequences for Holocaust survivors. In other words, the German psychoanalyst Werner Bohleber says, the field of psychoanalysis was the inner world of the human being, the unconscious and unconscious fantasies. For many analysts, the adequate integration of external reality seemed like an intrusion on psychic reality and the meaning of the unconscious. In other words, survival was what was at stake, if not survival in later life. Although questions of resilience, suicide, and the struggle to find life worth living were themes that analysts grappled with in their clinical encounters with survivors. So these were topics that were being kind of thrashed out here as analysts tried to deal with what they were seeing in front of them with survivors, and then to relate that to restitution claims and this fight that they were having with the Bonn government over who was eligible. So by the time he published his later clinical articles, De Wind was making the case for the idea of trauma being caused by his patients' experiences under Nazi rule, thereby, as I say, taking on the West German restitution process. This seems blindingly obvious to us now, but it's important historically to understand that this was not always the case, that this was something that had to be worked on for several decades before it became understood by clinicians and wider society. The analyses themselves remained consistent with his first post-war treatments. In 1971, de Wind claimed that the ability to regress had great survival value. A year later, he repeated the claim more emphatically. The capacity to regress proved essential to survival. These claims were made on the basis of clinical work with survivors. And by 1984, this is what he was saying: only those in whom the prerequisites for any form of quick adaptation existed, especially for a quick inversion of their view on life and death, had a chance to overcome the most difficult first weeks and months. In normal life, it is pathological if one can only think in terms of disaster and death. In the camp, the paradox was that only those who were able to accept the certainty of having to die could live on for the time being. It's hard to think of an argument that is more different from Bettelheim's and Frankl's. So the main point really is that de Wind not only foreshadowed the acceptance of trauma as a genuine diagnosis, but consistently offered, on the basis of his clinical and personal experience, a theory of survival that markedly differed from those prevailing in the post-war years. His arguments don't mark a complete break with those of Bettelheim and Frankl. And this is what's the paradox here, is that de Wind's argument is based on an analysis of his those he's treating, his patients. When you read Last Stop Auschwitz, the account of Hans suggests something different. Hans in the book is in a privileged position as a doctor in Auschwitz, albeit we know that the concept doctor in Auschwitz has very little to do with what we understand a doctor to be in terms of access to resources, hygienic circumstances, and so on. But he operated in the camp as a man not in control of his own destiny, but certainly you see him acting with guile and intelligence, trying to make decisions, in a position to make decisions in a way that was not given to the ordinary inmates. And so the arguments from Bettelheim and Frankl that one needed a rich inner life, spiritual resources, and so on to survive, we see that in de Wind as well. But I think it's not the full extent of his position. We can see perhaps in de Wind an example of the psychoanalyst Elie Kurilov's argument that after the war, psychoanalysts divorced their personal experience from their theories and clinical practice, albeit with a caveat in de Wind's case that, as we've seen, he by no means shied away from talking about and working with victims of Nazi persecution. Rather, what we see in his case is a tension between what he wrote in his transparently autobiographical account of Auschwitz and his later descriptions of working with survivors in a clinical setting, where he devised his theory of stupor. Unlike Frankl, however, it's clear from his clinical practice that de Wind was not satisfied only with reference to the inmate's spiritual life, and neither was Elie Cohen, to whom I'm going to turn next. Sorry, I should have put that one up before. That's the book by Christol, Massive Psychic Trauma. It's an important collection of essays. These are Cohen's two main books. Cohen cited de Wind's confrontation with death in his 1952 doctoral thesis, subsequently published as Human Behavior in the Concentration Camp, and which has been in print ever since. His long chapter on the psychology of the concentration camp prisoner indicates 3 stages through which inmates passed: initial reaction, adaptation, and resignation. He's clear that, quote, a prisoner's spiritual life was of very great importance, that it fitted him better for adaptation, and that through it he might considerably add to his chances of survival. Yet, Cohen criticized Bettelheim, as we've already noted, for stopping there and for suggesting that inmates failed to help themselves. Indeed, having stressed the importance of spiritual life, he then emphasized the need for inmates to lower their own spiritual standard, since, quote, if one wanted to survive, one could not but accept the standards prevailing in the camp. As with de Wind, Cohen's scholarly work is not always in accord with his own experiences, yet they seem more closely integrated than de Wind's. Cohen has much to say about depersonalization, regression, jealousy, group libido, and identification with the guards. But he always returns to, quote, one factor that was entirely outside the prisoner's control: luck, fate, accident, call it what you like, which often caused the prisoner's life to take an unexpected turn. The importance of a spiritual life, of resignation, and especially of luck, are all apparent in Cohen's own account of survival. That's this one, The Abyss, a confession. Like de Wind, Elie Cohen was in Block 9 at Auschwitz, where he worked as a doctor, having previously held the same position at Westerbork. In his frank confession, The Abyss, 1971, based on a series of interviews that had appeared in the newspaper The Vrij Nederland, Cohen says of himself that he, quote, climbed the social ladder fairly quickly in Westerbork, and that based on his experiences, he came to understand that man is an egoist. This is not explicitly the reason why his book was subtitled in the Dutch edition An Ego Document, but it tells us a great deal about Cohen's understanding of his survival. He explains on several occasions that only his position as a doctor saved his life, and that ending as the case reporting doctor in Block 9 meant having an important, prominent position. In several important respects, however, his disarmingly frank confession somewhat mitigates his self-criticism. He insists on the overriding fact of being a doctor and therefore prominent, but also notes the significance of having a close friend in Auschwitz. He didn't have his wife close by, as did de Wind and Louis Micheels, since she and their young son had been murdered on arrival at the camp. But above all, and here he comes close to confirming de Wind's theory of stupor, he attributes his survival to looking to his own protection through what he calls depersonalization. Quote, you looked on as though through a peephole, taking no part in things yourself. You watched it, it didn't concern you. Or as he wrote in his book, The 19 Trains to Sobibor, you had to learn to watch horrifying events with empty eyes. You could not afford to feel pity. You had to get calluses on your soul. In brief, you had to pass through a period of customization. So, although he agrees with Frankl and de Wind that a spiritual life considerably added to the chances of survival, he goes further, saying that the next condition essential for adaptation was the lowering of one's own spiritual standard. To this, he adds, somewhat confusingly, the drive for self-preservation, which sounds again like Frankl, but he concludes his book by citing Bloom's 1948 study, which emphasizes, as Bloom puts it, one great unpredictable force that ruled over life and death on the inmates. It was the anarchic power of accident. Cohen concurs, noting that the ability to adapt, which could take a year, was wholly dependent on the luck of surviving that long in the first place. The third analyst I want to turn to is Louis Micheels. And what happened to him adds to the store of information backing up de Wind's and Cohen's arguments. Micheels, a Jewish medical student in Utrecht in 1940, when the Germans occupied the Netherlands, was captured with his fiancée Nora in October 1942, as the two of them were attempting to cross the border into Belgium. Held first in Mechelen, Malines, in April 1943, they were deported to Auschwitz and separated. Micheels was initially sent to the slave labor plant at Monowitz, Auschwitz III, where he was put to work as a nurse in the camp hospital. After becoming ill himself, he was sent to the Auschwitz I Stammlager hospital, where after about a week, a parcel containing a note and a sardine sandwich arrived for him from Nora, who had been told of his arrival in the camp. She informed him that she was just a few hundred feet away in Block 10. Micheels interprets Nora's reappearance as an occurrence, quote, that could not have been more evocative of Oedipal wishes and fantasies. That's to say, Nora became for him, quote, the ideal woman who in reality was sexually out of reach, a fact that further enhanced the fairy tale nature of the relationship. Micheels' account is, like de Wind's and Cohen's, somewhat at odds with his theory of survival. Like them, he confirms the importance of close relationships, especially in small groups. His renewed contact with Nora is especially significant. Echoing de Wind's story of Hans's contact with Friedel, Micheels explains how he was smuggled into Block 10 and how miraculous it was in Auschwitz that a couple should be reunited in this way. He reserves especially high praise for his friend Paul, the Blockältester, who helped smuggle him into Nora's block and kept a lookout whilst he was there, saying, quote, even in Auschwitz, one could find true altruism. Like de Wind, Micheels stresses that these friendships were crucial. Quote, such a bond was essential as a protection against losing all traces of civilized behavior, and with them, a true sense of hope and reason for survival. And at one point, Micheels refers to another Dutch physician called Ed, working in Block 9, that's de Wind, obviously, from Ed's ward in Block 9, he could look out of the window into Nora's room and wave at her. After the war, Micheels immigrated to the US, where he became a practicing psychoanalyst and clinical professor in psychiatry at Yale. He and Nora were reunited in June 1945 in Amsterdam, but a few months later they separated. Nora had not expected Micheels to survive, and this fact hurt him, as Micheels felt that, quote, it took some unusual fortitude to accomplish this, and that she had surmised I did not possess this special ingredient. For his part, Micheels pondered years later, I am convinced that another important factor contributing to our parting grew out of my desire to forget the immediate past. When he published his memoir, this Dr. 117641, at the age of 72 in 1989, he drew on years of psychoanalytic work to explain his own survival. Although he stated somewhat vaguely that personality traits like an instinct for survival made a difference, Micheels also echoed de Wind in noting that I found that making myself inconspicuous might help me avoid trouble. What we see in Micheels' account is, like de Wind's and Cohen's, a theory of survival that doesn't quite concur with his account of his own experiences. Micheels emphasizes inconspicuousness in a way that's similar to de Wind's stupor, but it's clear that he also worked hard on sustaining close friendships and, above all, his real and imagined relationship with Nora, quote, the magic quality of which provided me with a sense of protection or immunity that sustained me through many harrowing experiences. And, Micheels says, I realized that as a doctor-nurse, I was sort of upper middle class in the camp society. Indeed, the fact that all three men were doctors, at least nominally able to practice their craft, however imperfectly in Auschwitz, gave them not just a sense of purpose, but access to resources and a status that by no means overrode the role of luck, but made their luck just a little less capricious than the average inmates. Okay, I've got a few concluding thoughts on what this all means. So first of all, providing an account of survival, as in de Wind's, Micheels' and Cohen's own accounts of their survival, is of course not the same thing as surviving. Whatever their personal traits, the psychologist survivors discussed here all survived, as they admit to a greater or lesser extent, through luck. Even if adopting a kind of stupor was a sine qua non, and we would be wise, I think, not to make this a universal condition, there will undoubtedly have been many inmates who took this stance but did not survive. Without luck, nothing was possible. So we can perhaps confirm, albeit cautiously, what three psychologists, Benner, Roskies, and Lazarus, wrote over 40 years ago, that denial and selective apathy were keys to survival. With active denial and selective apathy, cognitive appraisals continued, but they were reduced to bare essentials. The persecutees could not survive if their appraisals were not adjusted downwards to basic survival issues. Only those who could engage in selective apathy and active denial survived. Or, as the author of an article in the Polish Przegląd Lekarski Oświęcim noted, that's the Auschwitz Medical Review, noted in 1970, quote, suppression was the usual defense mechanism then. It enabled the prisoners to survive the most critical period. So selective apathy, suppression, what de Wind calls stupor. These are all similar kind of terms, I think. Wanting to survive and having a rich inner life is on its own an unsatisfactory explanation, for there were unquestionably many murdered who had such resources. Those who survived did so primarily through luck, and then through allowing themselves to adjust their expectations downward to get through each day. Nevertheless, it's undeniable that some of the most powerful accounts of survival that we have come from individuals who devoted themselves to caring for others, had a network of friends and a rich spiritual life, understood in the broadest sense. So there's a kind of paradox here. A great reversal took place in psychoanalysis with the formulation of the concept of trauma. After the war, it was still de rigueur to argue that psychic illnesses stemmed from childhood disturbances. As late as 1972, de Wind felt obliged to note that some of the experts among the German rehabilitation authorities were terribly wrong when they considered infantile neurosis to be the cause of the illness that followed after the war. Most of the prisoners were well balanced psychically until the war. The infantile neurosis only influenced the victim's reaction pattern. This denial that persecution was the cause of the last sequelae may well be inspired by the wish to minimize the enormous guilt of Nazi Germany. He was confirming what Christel and Nederland had written a few years earlier, when in response to studies such as those conducted by émigré analyst Hans Strauss that argued that survivors of Nazi persecution had a lower rate of mental illnesses than the population of New York, they noted that, quote, "We are confronted with the illogical conclusion that people's mental health is improved by persecution." And as the historian of psychology Dagmar Herzog notes, Hans Strauss was one of the favorites of the West German restitution authorities, unsurprisingly. Today, by contrast, at least according to psychologist Nathalie Seider, French psychologist, the trauma of concentration camp survivors has become the paradigmatic case of all psychic trauma. This isn't the place to recapitulate her claim that what was once called concentration camp syndrome has been redefined since 1980, when it was first codified in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, as PTSD, with the result that the specific suffering of the Nazis' victims has been occluded in favor of a supposedly universally applicable diagnosis for all trauma-related suffering. Nor is this the place to pass judgment on claims such as Jacob Lomrantz's, that the focus on psychopathological suffering and the overuse of the term survivor produces what he calls a bulldozer effect that prevents both differentiation and changing impact of the trauma across the lifespan. But if Seider is right, it matters a great deal to which accounts of survival we give credence. Both Bettelheim and Frankl, even if we grant that they, especially Bettelheim, stressed the importance of luck, favored an explanation that primarily placed store on the victim's will to live. That's to say, their being able to draw on inner resources. As we've seen, for de Wind, Micheels, and Cohen, even though their own accounts emphasize the importance of relationships with other people, they argue on the basis of their clinical work that survival was less to do with the inmate's inner resources than his or her ability to enter a stupor-like state in which acceptance of reality maintained a delicate balancing act with not surrendering. Micheels expressed this clearly when he wrote that he knew of people who survived more than 3 years in the camps, but who were killed in the final days of the war. People who, in his opinion, quote, had the essential ingredient or a will to sustain life, without which survival was impossible. Merely the fact that de Wind's and Cohen's studies were published in the immediate post-war period is not enough to accord them analytical priority. After all, the first incarnation of Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning was written or dictated in 1946, and Bettelheim's famous article on human behavior in extreme situations was published in the US in 1943. De Wind opened his article of 1949, Confrontation with Death, with the claim that, quote, immediately after liberation, people were keen to read everything that was published about the concentration camps. He then went on, the public devoured it all uncritically, but soon became sated. A year later, i.e. 1950, Horkheimer and Flowerman's famous foreword to the Studies in Prejudice series, which included Adorno et al.'s authoritarian personality, stated that, quote, today the world scarcely remembers the mechanized persecution and extermination of millions of human beings, only a short span of years away in what was once regarded as the citadel of Western civilization. The fact that de Wind's book has been republished to great acclaim in many languages in the last few years, and as I say, despite the kitsch marketing of the book, the text says what it says, speaks volumes about changing understanding of Holocaust trauma. The acceptance of PTSD as a clinical diagnosis for all the problems that have followed in its wake shows that it is no longer assumed that individuals will simply get better when conditions return to normal, or that with reference to children in particular, terrible situations leave few long-lasting marks on their psychological being. Psychoanalysis has long lifted itself out of Freudian orthodoxy, the Freud-Klein wars, and other issues pertaining to the struggle for a universal explanation. It has freed itself from the exclusive focus on the inner world and the question of the influence of unconscious fantasies on perceptions and the shaping of internal object relations in favor of greater insistence on social and cultural circumstances. At the same time, historians have learned to differentiate the concentration camps from the death camps, to understand that the camps were always changing, and that how a camp looked at the end of the war usually bore little resemblance to how it looked 1, 5, or in the case of Dachau, 12 years earlier, and to navigate the complexities of camp societies, which were also ever changing. It's perhaps no surprise then that a version of survival that stresses chance and existing in a kind of stupor rather than a will to live based on inner resources has come to assume greater persuasive strength. Studies by Lomrans and others have shown that many, but not all survivors were able to adjust to normal life in time, irrespective of the atrocious experiences they had endured. There may well have been survivors who rebuilt their lives after the Holocaust by believing that they survived because they willed it. But for most, and closer to the reality of what we know about the camps, survival was above all a matter of luck, in which neither fighting the system nor giving into it was able to dominate the mind. It seems remarkable now that these inmate physicians articulated this in the immediate post-war period, not because of how short a time had passed to allow them to gather their thoughts, but because the intervening decades have been dominated by wishful thinking, mythologizing the camps and survival thereof, and forms of treatment that have not always been kind to the former camp inmates. The acceptance of the idea of massive social trauma, the formulation of PTSD and its acceptance as a clinical diagnosis, the questioning of the monolithic concept of survivor syndrome, and the realization that Holocaust survivors are human beings with frailties and strengths like all other people, have gradually created a situation where in scholarly and clinical settings, if not always in commemorative ones, complexity and not myth-making prevail. Survival was not merely a matter of the individual's inner qualities, nor was a survivor's post-war life determined solely by the Holocaust. In what reads today as a truism, but in 1972, de Wind obviously felt needed to be said, quote, apart from the inner qualities of the survivors, a primary condition for their rehabilitation is to live in a world free from fear, injustice, and authoritative coercion. What de Wind and his colleagues teach us, and what they've been trying to teach us since 1945, is that the brutal reality of the Nazi crimes can only be understood when it is not idealized or turned into a manual for self-help. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dan, for a really wonderful, thought-provoking lecture that raises so many questions, and hopefully we will have some of those questions posed by the audience now. We will take questions from the room and also from Zoom, which is always interesting, but we will see how we get on. The technology is just about held up now. So if you are watching on Zoom, you can either type your question into the chat and we will read it out, or if you like, you can raise your virtual hand or say in the chat that you'd like to speak, and we will come to you and you will be able to speak as well. So is there anybody? Yes, I will. A few hands have gone up. Thank you. I'll pass it, yeah.
No, I have. You just need to select them.
Yes.
Thanks, Dan. That was fantastic. What did they each say about becoming psychoanalysts after the war? Like the fact that.
Can I tell? Oh, I'll do it from here. It's okay. They were each on the road to becoming. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that all three of them had studied medicine, or were in the process of getting their degrees when the war broke out, and were already on that road. So I think, as far as I remember, none of them says, as you might think, these experiences during the war are what led me to become a psychologist. They were already going down that track. So I think I don't have very much anything particularly interesting to say about that. I think they were already on that path, as far as I remember. Because
one thing that I thought about during your lecture was Adler's description of living through Tracy as a kind of ethnography. So I was wondering if they were already thinking of themselves as people on the way to becoming.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, yes. I mean, Adler's unusual in that sense, I think, in the way he describes it as a kind of ethnographer. But these three are certainly very conscious of being doctors in Auschwitz, and conscious of the privileges that gives them, and the ability to maneuver to a limited extent that's denied others. So yes, they're conscious of that, and they're trying to help others and observing that as they're sort of participant observers in that sense. Yes.
Great. We'll take one more question from the room and then we'll move to Zoom for a bit.
Yeah, this is all very interesting. I must admit, I'm not familiar with this body of literature. I remember once reading, but don't recall who actually explicitly said it, that when one is exposed to overwhelming pain and suffering, it doesn't soften the heart, but hardens the soul. So it made me wonder whether there is also a body of literature about the perpetrators and how they could continue what they were doing. The second question I had was about the choice of the word stupor. And I was wondering whether that was, I'm assuming De Wind wrote in Dutch.
Yes.
And
correct.
whether that was the word chosen as a translation for what he expressed. I remember meeting, when I lived in New York, a Dutch Jewish woman who even showed me her tattoo. But obviously, we didn't talk about her experiences in the camp because, one, it was not the appropriate relationship I had with her. You know, so that the word stupor, I guess, I don't know whether it's equivalent to resignation or what it is exactly.
That's a hard question for me to answer because I don't have the Dutch to hand, so can't compare it. But it would be easy to find out, I think. So you can find the Dutch original easily enough. But it comes from the article, The Confrontation with Death. But here I can't tell you what the original word that's used was. But yeah, it would be easy to find out. But with respect to your first question, yes, there's a massive literature on obviously on perpetrators in general, but in terms of a psychoanalytically informed approach to perpetrators, there is some work, but I think surprisingly little, actually, because there's a huge body of what's known as perpetrator research written by historians and social psychologists to some extent. But the part played by perpetrators is, I think, of the Holocaust, is one of the topics from 20th century history that most obviously allows for psychoanalytic vocabulary to be employed in terms of, let's say, Hitler as the superego, the identification with authority, the abandonment. No, this is I'm referring to. Let me finish, and then you can come. I'm referring to various writers who've made that claim. I'm not saying this is mine, but no, let me finish, and then I'll come back. Yeah, and then there's a whole. I think most historians, I would say, are reluctant to use psychoanalytic concepts because they don't want to apply ideas that are thought to pertain to the individual unconscious, to groups and to societies. But there are a few, like Dominic Lacapra and others, who use terms like the return of the repressed, transference and counter-transference and so on to talk about the relationship of perpetrators to authority, to their own actions and so on. And that seems to me, given that we're always confronted with the notion of the Holocaust as a phenomenon that it eludes our understanding, that in the turn to a psychoanalytic vocabulary, you have concepts that can help bridge that gap. Can we ask this lady here what to say some more about?
Yeah. When you mention superego is also reparative. It's about learning to have conscience and empathy and have positive guilt. But I want to, I just want to ask some questions here regarding, I think Freud thought that hate comes before love. And later on, he sort of hesitated. But the historian Tacitus said that the Germans are hard, obedient, and they cannot think for themselves. They go with the cold weather, whatever the cold weather dictates. But Freud thought, he was ambivalent actually. He thought that the Germans are a polytheistic society. And most of the practitioners at the time were godless Jews, intellectual godless Jews. That's what they call themselves. And also Freud. He thought we don't hear those other voices. So being a Jew and relying only on the interpretation of psychoanalysis never ever works, because there is a split here. I only believe in what my mind tell me, what my experiences tell me, and what my analysand tell me. So it's quite, I see a terrible confusion here. Maybe because at the Holocaust, it is impossible to understand.
I'm not quite sure I understand what you think the confusion is, but my point is not that psychoanalysis provides us with a complete understanding of the Holocaust. By no means. My point is that it's part of an arsenal of methodologies and approaches that we can use to try and make sense of it. And in this particular talk, what I'm doing is thinking as a historian why a particular set of concepts didn't make sense when they were first written about in the 1940s and 50s, and why they do make sense now. I'm not necessarily advocating for or against psychoanalysis or
Stop. Yeah, it is psychoanalysis cannot give us help. For it doesn't have reparation of something so unusual as the Holocaust.
Well, in that sense, nothing does it? So I think that's a perfectly reasonable conclusion.
Right, there's a couple of questions on Zoom, which you can probably all see, but I'll read them out anyway. Did these psychoanalysts believe there were differences in whether inmates were more likely to be able to adapt or access the stupor state, depending on their background, such as depending on age, previous experiences, etc.?
That's a good question. From the writing, I would say no. And I think this is also one of the potential weaknesses of psychoanalysis, where it's about, where those social or sociological factors are not really taken into account. It all has to do with what goes on in the individual's mind. And in that sense, again, I would say this is a vocabulary, a way of thinking that has potential to enrich our understanding of the history of the Holocaust, but of course, it's not going to be the answer. So I think the answer to that question is not very much. There's a point here from Rebecca Court. Verdoving seems to be the term for stupor. Okay.
And then we may as well take the next question as well. In regards to members of the Auschwitz Sonderkommando, how far would you say that these psychological theories can account for their role that tended to straddle the line between perpetrator and victim? There's a good literature on this. Could you provide some recommendations?
Okay, so the question is about the Sonderkommando in Auschwitz. So the group of inmates that had to that were forced to work in the gas chamber and crematoria complex, directing the Jews into those buildings before they were murdered, and then emptying the gas chambers and burning the bodies. First of all, I would say that I don't think that they straddle the line between perpetrator and victim. I think Primo Levi referred to them as one of his prime examples of as the grey zone. But I think these days most historians would argue that they were victims, pure and simple. They didn't choose to do the job that they did. The small number of them who survived are people who were I mean, it's painful to read their accounts or to, to listen to the interviews with them, people who are truly devastated by what they'd done, but they also speak to something that relevant to the talk I've just given, which is that human beings can and try to survive any circumstances that they're in. And the concept of stupor, I think, is particularly applicable here because there are survivors such as the Dragon brothers, Daniel Ben-Nachmias and others, Shlomo Venezia, who describe themselves as having become kind of robot-like during the period that they were working in the Sonderkommando. So I think that the psychoanalytical theories do have some purchase on the lives of the Sonderkommando. There is now some good literature on them. I would recommend Dominic Williams and Nicholas Chair's book, Matters of Testimony, which is a brilliant analysis of the so-called scrolls of Auschwitz. So the texts written by men in the Sonderkommando while they were working there and buried under the ground and dug up after the war, tales of their what they'd experienced there. Christina wants to say.
Thanks, Dan. That was fantastic. What a topic to pick because it shows so much. I'm wondering if transgenerational trauma came after this idea of trauma, or if that's already in the work that you were working with.
It's already in the work. I mentioned him at the start, but didn't say much more about him. But Hans Keilson is the main person there. So he described it as sequential traumatization, and that's he showed this in what we would now call intergenerational traumatization. So I don't know too much about it. I haven't really gone down that line, but it's certainly there from the very start that the people who are identifying trauma as a proper clinical diagnosis are identifying it across generations. Yes. So there's a couple of collections of Keilson's essays that you can easily get hold of. Christina.
I have a question about the history of trauma as well. Namely, I often associate trauma as a concept that comes from soldiers and the Vietnam War and PTSD coming from there. So how does this diagnosis of trauma in survivors relate to the diagnosis of trauma in soldiers? And was there more or less willingness in the community of psychoanalysts and psychologists to accept it when it related to war soldiers rather than survivors of the Holocaust?
It's a really good question. I think that the studies that were being done by people like those I've described here were preparatory to what was then discovered during the Vietnam War or in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. In other words, I think that the debates, particularly about restitution, those debates, I think, opened up a discussion in psychology and psychoanalysis that then meant that in the wake of the Vietnam War, the psychologists were kind of pushing at an open door. So that in a sense, what happened to the American soldiers after Vietnam confirmed what these writers had already been arguing in the 40s and 50s, I would say. So it's not quite, I wouldn't say it put it in terms of a kind of competition between them, that the readiness to hear that trauma was a real thing in respect to American soldiers, I think was prepared in a sense by the work being done with Holocaust survivors. Is the kind of background for this, railway spine, shell shock, all those early 20th century phenomena, fear of speed and flying and modern machines in general and so on. Those were things that we would now, I think, understand as trauma, but there was a sort of early groping towards this understanding. Yeah.
Thank you for a very humane lecture.
Thank you.
I'm not a member of the psychological community. I'm a retired lawyer. Just wondering whether we have a small group of Dutch practitioners writing about those who access psychotherapeutic remedies.
Yeah.
And whether that is an entire analysis of millions. I'm thinking of other groups that might have other systems. Have there been any studies of how, say, Orthodox Jews or communists survive? Because they might fit in with your stupa. They have external frames of reference.
Yes.
That you can go with. Jehovah's Witnesses,
They,
and another point, by chance, I accessed on holiday earlier this year Simone Wheeler's nephew, whose mother was a resistance heroine. She was at Montluc and at Ravensbrück and attributed her survival to people who are able to not only think about themselves, but arrange themselves in a group for whom they care.
Yes, I think it's a really good point, because one of the things that, look, I've spoken about three particular psychoanalysts. There's a huge literature on this subject, okay, on psychoanalytic reflections and dealings with the Holocaust from the period of the war up to the present. It's an enormous literature, and so there are articles, let's say, about survivor guilt, about concentration camp syndrome, about intergenerational trauma, about identification with the guards, about regression to childhood, etc. There are all of these things. And one of the things that I think stands out for me is the work of analysts like Anna Ornstein and others, which is about the importance of small groups. Because if you read the many survivor accounts, they very often will talk about, particularly ones written by women, will talk about the importance of substitute or surrogate families. In Ruth Kluger's book, for example, she talks about how she and her mother adopt another girl who effectively becomes her sister, and how this little family unit is so important to their survival. And so that, in a sense, speaks to the idea that having other people to care for and to care for you, that mutual support network, is extremely important. And that applies very strongly to the groups that you've identified. So I don't know, I can't remember if I think I left this out, but at one point, de Wind says, in general, in the camp, we saw that those whose lives had some kind of religious alignment, this in the broadest sense, also as a devotion to a political system or a humanistic philosophy, were the quickest to recover from the initial stupor. So those were better able to cope with the conditions. It didn't, of course, mean that they were immune from the bad luck of dying from disease, being shot, being beaten to death on the camp street, etc., etc. But those who were in those groups, particularly the communists, who had a very strong sense of group identity, were better able to survive than those who were not, and then after the war were better placed to recover quite quickly. I think that is demonstrably the case. Nevertheless, and this is a theme that we haven't really touched on yet, what that means is, and what you see this in, I think, in Bettelheim and Frankl's works especially, we're talking about primarily non-Jews in concentration camps. Whereas when we talk about the Holocaust, we're talking primarily about Jews in death camps. And so, you know, Bettelheim didn't see Auschwitz, Frankl might have done very briefly, etc. These books are, in a sense, unique because de Wind and Micheels and Cohen were all in Auschwitz. And there, I think, what they have to say about stupor and survival and the importance of groups is really important, because this is in the context of the Holocaust. So yes, I think it's a very important point, and those small groups were indeed crucial.
Means we can recast stupor as meaning you have a frame of reference which explains the world until you get to Auschwitz. You put it on hold in the background and adjust because you tune into the inevitability of history if you're Marxist or Hashem.
I don't know. I mean, I think
you shut down, you modulate and half shut down your outside reference, you've still got it.
But that's the kind of paradox of their work, isn't it? On the one hand, they're talking, they apply the concept of stupor to their patients, They say these people that I've treated survive because of this stupor, but when they reflect on their own lives, it doesn't seem quite so applicable. And that's so in a way, yes, you see both in action. Yeah.
The other translations.
Yeah, there's lots. Okay.
I was wondering if there were similar records of successful escapees from the camps.
There are accounts of escapees from the camps, for sure. The most famous is Rudolf Weber, subject of Jonathan Friedland's recent book, whose account is has been well known since the end of the war, and there are many others as well. So there was a book published not long ago called Escapees by von Fransecki, which is about people who, in all kinds of circumstances, people who jumped from trains, people who ran away from guards, but also people who escaped from camps. There are actually very few who escaped from Auschwitz, but there were. If you think about the revolt in Sobibor, for example, and other similar actions of resistance by Jews, then there are escapees, and they speak to a different kind of survival. They, at least in that moment of escape, they speak to a determination to resist, which is, I think it's a rather different story, but certainly they exist. Yes.
Thank you very much. Or in your psychoanalysis, in your presentation, do the writers or do the three psychoanalysts analysts talk more from the place of the sound, the existence of sound, vision, from the existence of vision from what they've seen, or from the wound in terms of survival?
Can you say a little more?
It's just that we carry in our lives, we carry sounds of the past, or the visions, or the wounds, and which one do you think or other? Sorry.
It's hard for me to say, because obviously we're not privy to the psychoanalytic encounter, except in terms of how they describe them, right? So one of the things that de Wind says at one point, which is quite, I would think today would not be acceptable in the psychoanalytic community, is that for somebody who has had the experiences of going through the Holocaust, I'm using now the term anachronistically, it's early, before the term Holocaust was common currency. He says it's important to have an analyst who's also traumatized by the same experiences. I wonder whether that's necessarily the best the situation for the talking cure, but I think what I'm trying to get at is that these three analysts, quite unusually, I think, for a lot of émigré analysts, the victims of the Jewish science, were speaking from the wound. They were, I think, aware of their own suffering, and I mean the transference and counter-transference involved in these situations must have been off the scale, right? So I think there was a very strong sense of the suffering of both parties to this encounter, and the professionalism required of the analysts in this setting to hear what their patient was saying must have been quite an accomplishment.
Mike?
Do you have a few questions that are coming on Zoom, so I will turn to those for a moment. This might be a question too obvious, but why were the initial assessments after the war upon the camp survivors heavily focused on their personal traits instead of what had happened inside the camps? Was there an unwillingness or incapability in the public government to grapple with these historical events?
Okay, the answer. Thanks, Anne, for that question. The answer is because I'm talking about psychoanalysts, and psychoanalysts treat individuals, and the concept of psychoanalysis is based on free association and the individual talking about what's going on in their mind and trying to contact with the unconscious and allow the unconscious to speak. And so that's why these are not the sum total of work being done after the war on survivors. The question of what had happened inside the camps, the willingness of others to grapple with these historical events was also present. There's a quite large literature from the mid-1940s onwards written by sociologists trying to understand the concentration camp system. There are early works by scholars in other social sciences as well, trying to make sense of what had happened. So, I mean, I cited a few there. If you think of the work by the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer and others, Lowenthal, again, you know, it's work that straddled psychoanalysis, sociology, philosophy, but there's plenty of work to be found from the late 1940s that does indeed deal with the social history of the camps.
One more of the Zoom questions. Do you have any thoughts on how we can put these psychoanalytical or psychological theories in conversation with Jean Amory's earlier writings on trauma, death, and violence, and with the writings of other psychoanalysts such as Dory Laub or Kathy Carruth?
Oh, that's a very large question. I mean, Laub is someone who I cite repeatedly in this study because he's one of the, I suppose, most important in terms of the development of oral history. You know, he was one of the founders of the Fortunoff archive. And the similarity or the proximity of the oral history interview to the psychoanalytical encounter is obviously quite clear. In psychoanalysis, you have, I mean, before the advent of group psychology, you have a dyad, the analyst and analysand, and in the oral history, you have a triad with the camera being the third party, which of course changes the dynamic, but nevertheless, there is quite a lot of similarity between the oral history and the psychoanalytic session. There's, I think, also Laub is important because he's one of the few that I know of. There's a chapter by maybe Crystal in that edited book, Massive Psychic Trauma, that I mentioned earlier. He's one of the few. Laub is one of the few who's written about psychotic survivors, institutionalized Holocaust survivors who have been largely forgotten in Israel and elsewhere. So there's a large psychoanalytic literature on debates about resilience, aging, illness, you know, whether Holocaust survivors live to a longer age than most people, or the extent to which they adapt or not, you know, the extent of their resilience. But there is also a group of Holocaust survivors who are mute, insane, etc., and who are institutionalized. And Laub, it's a kind of problematic article in various ways, but he writes about these people in at least we can say interesting ways. So Carruth, I think, is an obvious reference point for anyone working on trauma, but her work is obviously comes out of literature and the cultural studies appropriation of trauma as a metaphor, I think, and it's some way from what I'm trying to talk about here, which is, I think, a more historically attuned understanding of how the concept of trauma has changed over time. And actually, her work is a good example of what I refer to when I talked about the potentially monolithic understanding of trauma, because you know, she talks about the definition of trauma as the inability to experience an event as you're undergoing it, such that it comes back to you later on. And actually, I think a lot of psychologists would argue that what we think of as flashbacks and nightmares and so on amongst sufferers of PTSD are quite rarely or exceptionally playbacks of the event exactly as it happened, but they are kind of reminders of it, things that somehow trigger a particular association triggers a kind of sensory memory, but it's not necessarily. I think this comes from the movies more than anything else. It's this kind of notion that people who are traumatized play back exactly as it happened. That what happened to them is I think not always borne out by the clinical writings. Amory is more complicated, I think, because he's one of the great authors of a survivor text, and At the Mind's Limits, I think, is a book that is among the small canon of really, I think, life-changing books on the Holocaust. So I think if you don't mind, I'll just say yes, there are ways in which we could put them in conversation, but I'd have to think about how to do that. Without, I don't want to not do justice to Amory's work, so I'll stop there. Yes.
Thank you very much. I suppose I'm thinking, what's my question? Is something about, does de Wind say why he's writing? Why he's writing? Is it to bear witness, or, and is there a difference between sort of, descriptive memoir written quite soon after the war and something a bit more analytic that you've been talking about? I mean, how aware were the early writers in the late, in the 5 years after the war, aware of those sorts of dimensions?
Yeah. It's a very good question. They were aware of them, and actually the analyst Hilda Bloom, who I started with the quotation, "Death in a Nazi camp needs no explanation, survival does." She writes in the article that quotation comes from about how, which is actually a review article of about 12 things that had been published from the mid-30s through to the end of the war about the Nazi camps. She writes in that article about how writing is the start of a kind of repair process for the survivors. And I, as with most of these things, I think, yeah, it might have been for some of them, but for others, I'm not so sure. So I'm not sure who wrote there's a kind of preface to the text, which I'm not sure exactly who wrote it, maybe the translator, who says, Eddie hid and remained in the camp. It would take months before the war ended. He joined the Russian liberators. By day, he treated the often very ill survivors the Nazis had left behind, and also Russian soldiers. By night, having found a pencil and notebook, he began to write with furious energy about his experiences at Auschwitz. In his traumatized state, he created the character of Hans to be the narrator of his own story. Other than in a few instances, the horror of his experience was still so raw, he couldn't find the words to describe it in the first person. I'm not entirely sure. It's one page of italics before the text. I suspect maybe the translator. I've asked the translator, but
is it listed as fiction or non-fiction?
No. It's a memoir, but it's quite clear that. But I don't know. I mean, I think that's partly true, but you could also read it another way. That he very deliberately chose not to write in the first person, not because he was too traumatized to do anything other than that he did, but because it was also a strategy for the reader, for his wife, for all sorts of other reasons. No. No. Of course, Wiesel's Night in all its various versions are written in the first person. So yeah, absolutely. But de Wind's text is not. Yes.
We can take a couple more questions, and I think there's still a few on Zoom. Maybe we'll collect a couple now. Just state the obvious, mental health is a very complex area, and even more so when we view it through the Holocaust. It's cries for an interdisciplinary approach between psychology, psychiatry, and historians. Is such a study available? So I know we'll take Okay, someone asking for the recording to be made available. Oh, okay, it was just that one then.
Oh, well, that's, I think, quite a good place to end. Well, I mean, yes, there are various interdisciplinary approaches to the Holocaust written between psychology, psychiatry, and history. And Dominic Lecapra's work that I mentioned earlier is probably the best known, but the Israeli historian Amos Goldberg's book, Trauma in First Person, which is an analysis of diaries from the Holocaust period, makes brilliant use of psychoanalytic concepts to discuss the texts he's writing about, and I like to think that what I'm doing is also fits the bill here. So thank you for that question.
Okay, well, on that note, keep your eyes peeled for forthcoming book on the topic. Please join me again, Professor Dan Stone.